Hello, human geographers. We are back at it again this evening. Tonight, we begin our discussion of religion. And remember, religion and language lie at the foundation of culture. Both are men of facts, both confer and reflect people's identity. Now, before we get started with our discussion of religion, I want everyone to understand what we are going to be talking about with regards to religion. For many people, their beliefs are very personal, based on what they believe or do not believe. I want everyone to know what we are going to be talking about. We are not going to promote, nor are we going to devalue any religion. We are going to try and stay unbiased and neutral in our discussion of religions. In addition, I want to remind everyone that this AP course is still considered a survey course. With all the details that we go into, there are a lot of details that we are unable to discuss due to time constraints or because I simply don't know about them. So while what we're going to be discussing is generally true, there are a lot of local variations and individual nuances that we may not include. So while you're taking notes, if something seems different from what you've heard about this faith or how you practice this faith, please write it down. And that way we can have a larger and more comprehensive conversation about this during class. Now, finally, we're going to be looking at religions from the geographic perspective. And so that may be slightly different than the perspective of someone who is a follower of a particular faith. I want to encourage you, please let us know about those differences. Let us know about those discrepancies. I want to encourage us to have a deeper understanding of different faiths and different cultures. Now again, I want to stress, we are not going to be promoting or devaluing any particular religions in doing this. We're going to be looking at the facts. So let's start with that. Religion is an extremely difficult concept to try and define, but a couple of geographers defined religion as a system of beliefs and practices that attempts to order life in terms of culturally perceived ultimate priorities. And they explain that the idea of perceived ultimate priorities is often expressed in terms of should, what people explain or justify how they and others should behave based on their religious beliefs. That could include things from eating habits to dress codes. Religions will often set standards for how adherents should behave. And so an example of a religion would be something like Christianity. All right. Now, as far as classification goes, in much the same way that we classified language, we can classify religion. And so the next level down in our classification is branch, a large and fundamental division within a religion. So for example, in Christianity, there are three major branches. So one of them could be Protestantism. All right. Now, next level down is going to be denomination, a division of a branch that unites a number of local congregations into a single legal and administrative body. An example of a denomination of Protestantism could be the Methodist denomination. All right? And within Christianity, there are more than 33,000 different denominations. And then our final definition on this slide, as far as language classification goes, is sect, a relatively small group that has broken away from an established denomination. And sect often has a negative connotation to it, but that isn't always the case, and we can look at it as an example to support that. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, known as LDS or the Mormons, began as a sect breaking away from larger Christian branches and now is considered its own separate branch of Christianity by religious geographers and people that specialize in this area. So while sect can often carry a negative connotation, we can clearly see that that isn't always the case. Now, it can be a negative thing, but a sect by itself isn't automatically negative in nature. So we want to make sure we're clear on that. All right, so let's take a look at an example, a visual example of this. So we've got Christianity as the religion, Protestantism as the branch, and then we have a different denomination than what we gave on the last slide, Lutheranism. And now we add another layer, and that is congregation. But if you go back to the definition of denomination, it says a division of a branch that unites a number of local congregations into a single legal and administrative body. So congregations are going to be the very local element of religion and religious classification. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do here is try and add another example using your prior knowledge of religion. It could be a religion you've heard of. It could be a religion you follow. But try to not add another example using this same kind of vocabulary. See how far you get. See where you might have trouble classifying. All right, let us continue to discuss ways that we could classify different religions. And for this slide, we're going to look at categories that mainly involve how a religion acquires adherents or followers and at what scale. We start with universalizing religions. A religion that claims global truth and applicability, regardless of ethnicity or culture group, and seeks the conversion of all people via evangelism and missionary work. Universalizing religions actively seek converts and view their belief systems as universally appropriate and appealing. Now, there are relatively few universalizing religions. Christianity, Islam, and Buddhism are the three most prominent. And historically speaking, chronologically speaking, they're of relatively recent origin. Yet, they still represent more than half of the world's population, 58% in fact. We contrast that with ethnic religions, which are religions with a relatively concentrated spatial distribution, whose principles are likely based on the physical characteristics of the particular location in which its adherents are concentrated. Ethnic religions do not actively seek converts. Membership in ethnic religions is often conferred by birth. You're born into it. And historically, they have not actively sought converts. But even that gets kind of tricky. Because, for example, a lot of Western academics define Hinduism today as an ethnic religion because they don't actively seek converts. And to be fair, that is the way that we will classify it in our class for the AP exam, as an ethnic religion. But historical evidence shows that Hindus had migrated into Southeast Asia, diffusing their religion as a universalizing religion would, before the diffusion of Buddhism and Islam into Southeast Asia. Now, notice that 58% of the world's people identify with universal faiths, like Christianity and Islam. Another 26% identify with ethnic religions, of which Hinduism constitutes the largest portion. But that only adds up to 84%. So where's the other 16%? All right, now let's talk about another way that we can classify religions. And this is going to be based on the number of gods or deities. Adherents of monotheistic religions worship a single deity or god, which in Arabic is pronounced Allah. That's going to be important later. Mono means one, so a single deity. Believers of polytheistic religions worship more than one deity. Poly means multiple or many. Sometimes that can be thousands of gods or deities. Now, somewhere around 3,500 years ago, however, a monotheistic religion developed in Southwest Asia called Zoroastrianism. Some academics believe that the monotheism of late Judaism, Christianity, and Islam can be traced back to Zoroastrian roots, while other academics believe that Judaism was the first monotheistic faith. Now, whichever is correct, the eventual diffusion of Christianity and Islam, both universalizing and monotheistic religions, throughout much of the world led to a major theological shift away from the long dominance of polytheistic beliefs. Now, even this gets kind of complicated because, for example, Hinduism, which includes the worship of many deities, Many people believe and consider it to be polytheistic. However, Hindus consider all deities as manifestations of a single God called Brahman, or the universal soul, with each of the other gods representing or serving as the various expressions of Brahman. So in that way, it can be considered monotheistic. Now, to add to this slide, we also have syncretic religions. For example, certain African and Roman Catholic traditions became fused as a result of the African slave trade, giving rise to the syncretic religions of Santeria in Cuba and Candomblé in Brazil. Okay, so make sure that you add syncretic religions to this slide. Now, we can also add animistic beliefs to this, because throughout much of human history, virtually all religions were either animistic, polytheistic, or both. Animistic beliefs or religions are centered on the idea that inanimate objects such as mountains, boulders, rivers, trees possess spirits and therefore should be revered. All right? Now, there are approximately 100 million people in the world that would be classified as following an animistic belief. Now, that doesn't mean that they all follow the same belief. It just means that they believe that what others would consider inanimate objects have a discrete spirit and conscious life. Now, most of that 100 million is in Africa. And about 12% of Africa's population identifies with animistic beliefs. Now, the overwhelming majority of Africans identify with monotheistic, universalizing beliefs of Christianity and Islam. And the highest number of animists would be found in countries like Mozambique, Cameroon, Togo, and Benin. But animism is seen around the world, particularly in rural areas, like the areas in orange on this map above. Now, another example that isn't seen on this map, that would be classified as animistic, would be the beliefs of Australian Aborigines. And some Native American beliefs would fall into animism and animistic beliefs as well. Now, a tribal religion is a special form of ethnic religion, distinguished by their small size, unique identity with localized culture groups that are not absorbed into modern society and often have close ties to nature. These are also known as indigenous religions and are local in scope, usually have reverence for nature, and are passed down through family units or groups or tribes of indigenous people. Now, we don't group indigenous religions together because they share a common theology or belief system. That isn't the case. We group them together because they share the same pressures from the diffusion of global universalizing religions and the fact that they still persevere and exist. That's the clustering and why we classify them together. Now, shamanism is a form of tribal religion, but to be clear, not all tribal religions are shamanist. Shamanism is a set of beliefs and practices in some tribal religions based on the belief that there is a hidden world of gods, ancestral spirits, and demons that are only responsive to a shaman or some kind of interceding priest. And it is often a community faith in which people will follow their shaman or religious leader or teacher or healer or visionary and their teachings and interpretation of the world. Okay? Examples of shamanist groups can be found in Africa, Native American groups, and throughout Southeast Asia and East Asia. Now that we've covered the different ways that we could classify religions, let's start looking at them specifically. There are three major hurts that we can identify, but as always, details are going to vary depending on the source that you're looking at. The Middle East hearth is also known as the Semitic hearth and is the hearth of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, what are commonly called the Abrahamic religions due to their shared history that is traced back to Abraham. Zoroastrianism could be included in this hearth as well. The Northern Indian hearth is also known as the Indic hearth and is the hearth for Hinduism and Buddhism, as well as Sikhism and Jainism. Finally, there is the East Asian hearth, which is home to Shintoism, an ethnic religion found in Japan, but also the Chinese philosophies of Confucianism and Taoism. Now, if we are including philosophies as part of our discussion on religion, one of the approved textbooks adds a fourth hearth. That final hearth would be, and the one that is least commonly given as a hearth of religion, is the northern shore of the Mediterranean Sea, because that is the hearth of Greek philosophy. So just to be clear, you're often not going to see this listed as a hearth of religion because it's a hearth of philosophy instead, all right? But if we're including East Asian philosophies in our conversation of religion, we should probably include Greek philosophy as well. And so this graphic does a really good job of showing the interconnected nature of religion and philosophy, as well as the impact of earlier religions on the development of later religions and how they influence one another. So kind of an interesting take on this. All right, so let's take a look at the world. Let's start, as we always do, with a couple of questions. What type of map is this, and at what scale? It is a choropleth map at the national scale. This is one of our core maps for our religion chapter and is one of the maps that you'll need to print off and attach to your map packet. Super important. I could expect any number of questions to come from this particular slide in this particular map. It shows the distribution of religion around the world, and it also adds a pie chart for different regions to help illustrate the degree of homogeneity or diversity of religion within these regions. Now, we do need to address some issues on this map because induction is definitely a problem. Remember, induction suggests the map makes a claim that isn't supported by the data. And so on this map, the shadings show the major religion of the area while leaving out minority religions of those areas, many of which may have a significant number of followers. Take India, for example. It's shown as a Hindu region, but Islam and Sikhism attract millions of adherents in India. In fact, more than 160 million people in India are Muslim, making India the third largest Muslim country in the world, behind Indonesia and Pakistan. In fact, more than 80% of Islam's 1.6 billion followers live outside of the Middle East. And it should be noted that not everyone in the Middle East, or the region that we could call Southwest Asia and North Africa, is Muslim. The region is home to millions of Christians and Jews, as well as other smaller religious sects. Now, since we're talking about Islam, let's talk about its two major branches, Sunni and Shiite, or Shia. Sunni is found in gray on this map and is the clear majority of Muslims in the world. In fact, no more than 15% of Muslims are Shiite Muslims, although they make up a majority of the population in 4 countries, and those are Iran, Iraq, Azerbaijan, and Bahrain. Now, you absolutely need to know that Iran is a Shiite majority country. And remember from our language chapter that Iran speaks Farsi, which is an Indo-European language, and is distinctly different from the Afro-Asiatic Arabic language that dominates the Middle East, as well as the Islamic faith. That absolutely sounds like a nice little AP exam multiple choice question. Now, notice the dominance of Roman Catholicism in Latin America, parts of Anglo-America, and particularly areas that were colonized by Southern Europe. Now, Eastern Orthodoxy gave rise to 15 different independent churches, including The examples that we could give are the Greek Orthodox Church, as well as the Russian Orthodox Church. And then the Protestant branch of Christianity dominates much of the areas that were colonized by Northern Europe, including Anglo-America, Australia, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Now let's get into more detail about religion in Anglo-America. All right, let's start with what type of map are we looking at and at what scale. And it's a little bit tricky here because this is a choropleth map, not tricky there, but this is at the county scale. And you don't see the county lines, but that's what they're using to look at the distribution of Christianity in the United States. This is another core map that you will need to print off and know. And it looks at, in particular, the different denominations of Christianity or branches of Christianity that we will see. So there's a few regions that I want you guys to know. Baptists in the Southeast and Methodists in the Midwest, okay, are where those denominations were diffused, particularly by traveling preachers during the 1800s. Now, Lutherans live mostly in the upper Midwest, where the German or Scandinavian forebears immigrated in the late 1800s, looking in particular for good farmland. Many Mormons live in or near Utah, where Mormons settled in the mid-1800s after religious persecution drove them out of Missouri and Illinois. And then everywhere else is dominated by Catholicism, which is a different branch of Christianity than we've been talking about here. But Roman Catholics are most common in urban areas of the Northeast and throughout the Southwest. Now, Jews, Muslims, as well as Hindus live most often in urban areas because that was the traditional home for many immigrants as they moved into the United States. Now, this map again falls into the same issue of induction that the previous map did because there is very much religious diversity across the United States. And in this case, it only shows the majority religious group by county. Now, what that means is that a religious group could be 100% of the population in that county, and it's shaded the same color as a county where that religious group only represents 50.1% of the population. So, as always, we want to be skeptical and questioning and understanding different things. Now, with regards to the Roman Catholic branch of Christianity, it has followers all across the world and all across the United States. Now, while there are more followers in the Northeast and the Southwest, there are Catholics in every state of the United States. And Roman Catholicism is a good example of a hierarchical religion. So picture a pyramid. Now, you won't be able to see it on this map, but at the bottom of that pyramid are parishes. And parishes are administered by priests. Now, when several parishes together constitute a diocese, which is administered by a bishop. Those are the black lines that you see on the map above. So this is kind of tricky. I intentionally did not ask what scale is this at because it's a little misleading. It's definitely not at the county scale because if you look at Nevada, there's only 2 divisions. All right, so we want to take a look at different boundaries, and this is an example of a boundary as established by the hierarchical religion of Roman Catholicism. Right? Now, when you group together several dioceses, that makes up a province, which are the red boundaries, and are administered by an archbishop. Now, the principal or home church of the archbishop within a province is known as the archdiocese. And notice that they tend to be found in big cities, San Francisco, LA, Chicago, Detroit, New York. And notice that there is a dot distribution component to this map because the regions of the countries where Catholics tend to be the clear majority of the population, namely the Northeast and the Southwest, we see a greater number of dioceses, provinces, and archdioceses. Right? Now, just to review what your pyramid should look like at this point. At the bottom, we have parishes, which are administered by priests. Then above that, we have dioceses, which are administered by bishops. Provinces are going to be above that, which are administered by archbishops. Now, some archbishops may be cardinals, And cardinals are responsible, whenever it is necessary, for selecting the person at the very top of the Catholic hierarchy, and that is the Pope. Now, the Pope, in addition to being the person in charge of the entire Catholic Church, also administers the Diocese of Rome, within which Vatican City, the seat of the Pope and the Catholic Church, is located. Now, let us take a look at a comprehensive pie chart of religion in the world. Let's start. What are some notes or observations you could make about this particular graphic? Now, let's make some notes about some of the statistics that we see here. Christianity is the largest religion in the world with more than 2 billion followers. More than 50% of those are Roman Catholic, followed percentage-wise by Protestantism and then by the Orthodox branch of Christianity, sometimes called Eastern Orthodox. Now, when you add up all the smaller Christian churches together, they encompass about 4% of the world's population. So all these numbers are the total percentage of the world's population. The next largest religion is Islam, with more than 1.5 billion followers, the vast majority of which are Sunni Muslims. We already mentioned that no more than 15% of the world's Muslims are part of the Shiite branch, and when you compare that to global population numbers, that means that only about 3% of the world's people are followers of Shiite Islam. The third largest religion in the world is Hinduism, an ethnic religion, followed by Buddhism. Now, when we say Chinese traditional, what we're really talking about is Confucianism and Taoism, some of those philosophies that we talked about earlier. Now, I asked you earlier where the other 16% of the world's population was located. And we see it on this graph in what is classified as non-religious, what is often called secular. Now, another thing that the previous core map disguises is the rise of secularism, which we'll discuss in detail here in a moment. But to illustrate the impact of non-religious populations on the world, religion core map, go back to that slide and notice that France was identified as a Roman Catholic country. But a large proportion of the people in France profess adherence to no particular faith. Now, here in the United States, we can look at the different statistics, all right? Overwhelmingly, the country is Christian. You can see some of the other faiths over here towards the bottom and on the right-hand side. But of that, 51% are Protestant, of the Protestant branch of Christianity. And then it gets into some of the different, areas and things like that. And then we get into, the different branches. Catholic is about 23%, so on and so forth. All right. But notice that about 16% of the U.S. population identifies as unaffiliated. And then it breaks it down into atheist, agnostic, and other things like that. So what does all that mean? Well, secularism is the indifference to or rejection of formal religion. So, if 1 billion people are considered non-religious, that means that roughly 6 billion are considered religious of some branch or denomination or faith or something. Okay? But that needs to be qualified, because when people are asked if they're a member of a religion, that is different than if they are an active participant or follower of a religion. All right? Now, most secular countries in the world today are found in Europe. To illustrate both of these points, in Scandinavia, fewer than 3% of people reported frequent religious attendance. In France and Great Britain, it's less than 10% reported attending church at least once a month. But even in a secular society, and regardless of your religious beliefs, what you eat, where you work, when you shop, what you're allowed to do, are often influenced by religion. Now, there's different identifications that fall into non-religious or secular. One of them is atheist, which means that they do not believe in any god or gods. Now, it's important to note that China is officially atheist. Does that mean that no one in China believes in any gods? Of course not. Okay? It's just the official stance of the government. But in China, there are obviously Chinese philosophies that we've been discussing, but also millions of Buddhists, Christian, and Muslims, as well as other faiths. Now, agnostic means that an individual is uncertain if God or gods exist and what form or role they may take or play. Now, often when the topic of agnostics comes up, one thing that is often discussed is evidence. Individuals that may identify as agnostic may be looking for evidence that God or gods exist. Now, we wanted to talk about some examples in Anglo-America. So let's look at secularism in Anglo-America. First off, what type of map are we looking at? Choropleth. At what scale? And that gets kind of tricky. I would say subnational because it's kind of a catch-all, but it is below the provincial scale, what we would call counties in the US, but only 5 Canadian provinces have counties. So I'd be kind of interested what specific scale they were using when they collected this data. Now notice, the western part of the country, like British Columbia, is entirely in the highest class that identifies as non-religious or no religion. Conversely, the entirety of Quebec is in the lowest category, meaning that more people identify with religion in Quebec. And what religion do you think that would be in Quebec? Now, this data can vary by group because in Canada, recent immigrant groups of Buddhists and Hindus, particularly on the West Coast, and Muslims in the eastern part of Canada have a higher rate of adherence to their religion than do many of Canada's residents who have been there for generations. Now, with regards to the United States, when the wealthiest countries in the world were surveyed, the United States stood out as the most religious, with 55% of Americans surveyed saying that religion is very important in their lives. Only 13% of people surveyed in France, 19% in Great Britain, and only 7% in Czechia declared religion to be of the same level of importance in their lives. Now, conversely, respondents in regions of Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, Southwest Asia, and Latin America strongly agreed that religion was very important in their lives. 98% of Senegal, 97% of Bangladesh, 95% of Indonesia, and 78% of people in Brazil identified with this strongest response that it is very important in their lives. But secularism has become more widespread during the past century, as you can see in this Pew Research data. And even if people continue to be members of their church, participation in church activities has declined. For example, there was a time when almost all shops and businesses were closed on Sundays. Today, shopping centers are mostly open as usual on Sundays. But there are still some communities where that doesn't happen. And that's why it's important to look at data at different scales. What scale is this choropleth map at? It's at the county scale. Now, religious traditions are still quite strong in some cultural regions of the United States, and Sunday observance continues at very high levels in, for example, the Mormon culture region found out west. Where else do you think we would find far more strict adherence to Sunday observation looking at this map? Make a prediction. We end tonight's lecture with an article that's based on that Pew Research data that we've been talking about. We saw data a few minutes ago that said that the US population was 51% Protestant. But based on the most current data, that number has dipped below 50%, more specifically to 48%, as you can see in this graph. Now, I want you to consider the impacts of religious change. What political impacts might arise with changing demographic and cultural traits? How might this impact the cultural landscape and people's day-to-day operation in their life? Think about that. Have a wonderful night, and I'll see you guys back in class.